What does it mean to write a novel about the inner lives of people in a world that had never conceived of such a thing before? Somewhere in the imperial court of Kyoto, around 1,000 years ago, a woman sitting behind a screen began writing a story that had no precedent, a narrative that followed the emotional and psychological experience of love. Its characters with a depth and intimacy that the world would not see again in literature for centuries. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hotsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
There is a writer whose name we are not entirely certain of, whose face we cannot see, whose life we know only through fragments, and who nonetheless produced a work so technically advanced and so psychologically rich that scholars in every generation have returned to it as one of the founding documents of world literature. Tonight we turn to a figure who worked in a world designed to render women invisible, and who within those very constraints created a story that has never been forgotten. The question before us is how a woman observing the world from behind a screen in a medieval Japanese court produced a narrative that anticipated the psychological novel by nearly 900 years.
The answer begins not with a single moment of inspiration, but with a culture that had spent generations making the interior life the primary subject of artistic expression, and with a woman who was positioned, by circumstance and by talent, to capture that culture at its height.
We are speaking about Murasaki Shikibu.
Murasaki Shikibu was a Japanese noblewoman and writer of the Heian period, active in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, who is credited with authoring The Tale of Genji, a narrative of approximately 1,000 pages that is widely regarded by scholars as the world's first full-length psychological novel.
Then let us begin with the world she was born into, and with what made it the particular kind of place where such a work became possible.
The Heian period in Japan, which lasted from 794 to 1185, takes its name from the city of Heian-kyo, meaning capital of peace and tranquility, which was later renamed Kyoto, and which served as the seat of the imperial court throughout this era. During the Heian period, a small aristocratic class centered on the imperial court developed what is arguably one of the most aesthetically sophisticated cultures in medieval world history. Poetry, calligraphy, music, costume, architecture, garden design, and ceremonial practice were all treated as serious arts, and the cultivation of beauty was understood as a moral and intellectual discipline. Within this culture, literary expression was not a specialized profession, but a basic social skill of the educated class. Courtiers communicated in poetry. Exchanges of poems were the primary medium of romantic and diplomatic correspondence. The ability to compose a verse appropriate to a season, a mood, or a moment was considered as essential as knowledge of ceremony or protocol.
So, the environment in which Murasaki developed as a writer was one in which literary skill was not exceptional but expected.
Yes, and yet her achievement transcended what that environment typically produced, precisely because she used the materials of courtly literary culture to do something that courtly literary culture had not done before. Murasaki Shikibu is a court name rather than a personal name. Her actual birth name is unknown, which is itself a revealing fact about the social position of women in Heian Japan. Women of her class were often recorded only by the court titles of their fathers or husbands, and their personal names were considered too private for public use. She was born into a provincial branch of the Fujiwara clan, the dominant aristocratic family of the Heian period, probably sometime in the 960s or 970s. Her father was a scholar and provincial governor, with a particular devotion to Chinese classical literature, a devotion he passed on to his daughter. The story of her early education is told in her own diary. She describes how she absorbed Chinese, the prestige literary language of the educated class, by listening to her brother's lessons and mastering the text faster than he did, to her father's mixture of pride and regret.
So her father recognized her exceptional ability, while simultaneously understanding that a woman's mastery of Chinese learning was more burden than asset in the world she would have to live in ill.
Yes, and this tension between intellectual capacity and social constraint ran through her entire life and informed the extraordinary sensitivity with which she rendered the inner lives of women in the Tale of Genji. She married a distant relative, Fujiwara no Nobutaka, sometime around 998, and had a daughter who would herself become a celebrated poet. Her husband passed away in 1001, leaving her a widow at a relatively young age. It was probably during this period of widowhood that she began composing what would become the Tale of Genji, a work that circulated in manuscript among the court aristocracy, and which attracted enough attention that she was recruited around 1005 to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Empress Shoshia.
So the work preceded her court service rather than emerging from it. She arrived at court already as a writer of recognizability.
Yes, and her time at court then provided additional material, and a more direct view of the social dynamics she had already begun to explore in the narrative. Now we must address one of the most important and most frequently simplified claims made about the tale of Genji, the assertion that it is the world's first novel. There were long prose narratives before Genji, in Japan, in China, in the classical Mediterranean world, and elsewhere. The claim that Genji is the first novel rests on a specific and contested definition of what a novel is, and different definitions produce different answers. What most scholars who make the claim mean is this: Genji is the earliest surviving long prose narrative in which the primary subject is the psychological interior of the characters, in which the plot is driven not by external events but by the emotional responses of people to one another, and in which the reader is invited to interpret behavior, motivation and feeling with the kind of nuance we associate with the modern novel.
So the claim is not simply about length or narrative form, it is about a specific kind of psychological attention that the work directs at its characters.
Yes, and by that definition, Genji stands apart from what preceded it, in a way that is genuinely significant. The narrative follows Hikaru Genji, the brilliant and beautiful second son of the emperor, who is removed from the imperial succession for political reasons and lives his long life at the center of the court social world. But what makes the narrative remarkable is not the events of Genji's life in themselves. It is the texture of how those events are experienced. Every encounter, every relationship, every separation is rendered through the consciousness of the characters involved, through their internal responses, their recollections, their emotional reasoning. Murasaki constructs an unusually large cast of women, characters whose inner lives are rendered with particular depth. The women around Genji are not simply objects of his attention. They are subjects with their own desires, fears, resentments, and private understandings of what is happening to them.
So, the narrative is built from the inside of the characters rather than from the outside, from the pattern of events.
Yes, and this inward orientation is deeply connected to the central aesthetic and philosophical concept of the Heian world, the concept known as mono, no-aware. Mono no-aware is usually translated as the pathos of things or the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. It describes the emotional response to the knowledge that all beautiful things, all moments, all people, all seasons will pass and cannot be held, in Heian culture, simultaneously, knowing that it will not last.
So the aesthetic sensibility of the culture was structured around loss rather than possession.
Yes, and the tale of Genji is saturated with this sensibility. The narrative is full of moments that are beautiful precisely because they are ending, relationships that flower and then dissolve, seasons that arrive and depart, characters who are young and then old. The passing of time is not a backdrop to the story. It is the story. The structural organization of the text also reflects this preoccupation. The narrative is organized into chapters, each named often after a plant, a season, or a natural image, and each carrying a particular emotional atmosphere, rather than a conventional plot development. Poetry is woven throughout the text in a way that is inseparable from the prose. Characters communicate, express emotion, and demonstrate character through the poems they compose. A poem given in response to a situation is itself a form of action in this world. The narrator voice in Genji is also remarkable. It shifts between proximity and distance, sometimes describing events with close intimacy, and sometimes stepping back to offer a broader reflection on the nature of human experience. This fluidity anticipates techniques that European novelists would not develop for many centuries. The later chapters of the text, sometimes called the Uji chapters, shift their focus from Genji himself to the next generation, and adopt an even more melancholy and psychologically complex tone. Some scholars have debated whether these chapters were written by Murasaki or by a later hand. The consensus today favors her authorship, but the question itself reflects how carefully the text has been read.
Though reading Genji requires a different relationship to language than most readers bring to fiction. The poetry is not decoration, it is argument.
Yes, and this is one of the reasons why translation is such a complex challenge for the text. Every translator of Genji makes fundamental interpretive decisions about how to render poetry, how to manage the narrative's particular approach to naming and referring to characters, and how to convey emotional states that are embedded in cultural associations which do not exist in most target languages. There have been multiple major English translations of the tale of Genji over the past century. The most influential early translation was by Arthur Waley, published in the 1920s and 30s, which rendered the text in a prose style that captured something of its atmosphere, but made substantial, interpretive choices. Subsequent translations by Edward Seidensticker, Royal Tyler, and Dennis Washburn have each approached the text differently, reflecting evolving scholarly understanding and different priorities in rendering a work of such complexity for modern readers.
So the text has generated its own tradition of scholarly engagement across a century of Western reading, with each translation being itself an interpretation.
Yes, and within Japan the text has been a continuous presence in literary and cultural life for 1,000 years. It was copied by hand through the medieval period, studied by court scholars, used as a model for poetry and prose style, and eventually printed when printing technology arrived in Japan. The survival of the text is itself remarkable. No original manuscript in Murasaki's hands survives. The text exists through copies, some quite old, others much later, and the relationship between these copies and the original is a major area of scholarly work.
So what survives is a tradition of transmission rather than a single original document.
Yes, and this is true of nearly all texts of comparable antiquity. The fact that Genji survived at all, given the fragility of the materials and the political disruptions of the centuries that followed the Heian period, is a testament to the cultural prestige and perceived importance of the work.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to experience this work directly, where would you invite them to begin?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with the Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu.
So rather than beginning with a secondary study, the recommendation is to encounter the work itself.
Precisely. The text follows the life of Prince Genji and the intricate relationships within the imperial court of Japan, exploring themes of love, ambition, beauty, and the passage of time with detailed psychological insight, and a poetic language that remains extraordinary, even in translation. A reader coming to it for the first time is advised to choose a translation carefully. The Royal Tyler or Dennis Washburn translations are both highly regarded for their scholarly fidelity while remaining accessible to a general reader.
Is it a difficult work to enter for a reader unfamiliar with Heian culture?
It asks something different of a reader than most Western fiction. Its pace is deliberate, its attention is focused on emotional nuance rather than action, and it rewards patience in a way that becomes increasingly evident as one moves deeper into the narrative. Many modern readers find that after the first 50 pages, the world of the text becomes fully inhabitable, and that the experience of reading it is unlike anything else in literature.
So reading it gives a reader both the work and the world it was written in simultaneously.
Yes, and there is no better way to understand what Murasaki Shikibu achieved than to experience the achievement directly.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Murasaki Shikibu and the tale of Genji operates across multiple registers, each of which illuminates something different about what the work has meant over time. Within Japan, Genji has functioned as a kind of cultural foundation text, a shared reference point for literary, artistic and philosophical discussion across 1,000 years. The scenes and characters of the narrative have been depicted in painting, illustrated scrolls, theater, woodblock prints, manga, film, and digital art. Genji is present in Japanese culture in the way that certain Shakespeare plays are present in English culture, as a set of stories and images so thoroughly absorbed that they are recognized even by people who have not read the original.
So the work has generated its own visual and cultural tradition that extends far beyond literary readership.
Yes, and Murasaki Shikibu herself has become a cultural figure whose significance extends beyond the work she produced. She is recognized in Japan as a national literary treasure and appears on the 2,000 yen note, making her one of the very few women to be honored on Japanese currency. In the history of literature more broadly, the tale of Genji has become central to discussions about the origins of the novel as a form, about the relationship between women's writing and literary innovation, and about the tendency of Western literary histories to treat the novel as primarily a European achievement. The conventional account that locates the origin of the novel in 18th century England, with texts like Robinson Crusoe or Pamela, requires ignoring a Japanese text that predates them by 700 years, and that satisfies every significant criterion of the form.
So the claim about Genji being the first novel is also a claim about whose literary history has been considered universal.
Yes, and that reframing has become increasingly central to comparative literary scholarship in recent decades, as the field has moved away from a primarily European and North American frame of reference. The fact that Genji was written by a woman is also significant in ways that extend beyond biographical interest. Literary traditions are shaped by who is allowed to write within them, and the Heian period presents the unusual case of a tradition in which women were among the most important and innovative writers. Because Shinese, the prestige-written language of scholarship and government in Heian Japan, was dominated by men, women were more often writing in Japanese vernacular, which was considered a less serious but more intimate medium. This apparent disadvantage became a creative opportunity. The Japanese vernacular prose tradition of the Heian period, developed primarily by women writing in their own social world, produced not only Genji, but also the Pillow Book of Sai Shonagon, one of the great essayistic works of world literature, and a body of diary writing that constitutes a remarkable archive of inner life.
So the marginalization of women from the prestige literary tradition created the conditions for a different kind of literary tradition to emerge.
Yes, the women of the Heian court, writing behind their screens in the language that men had not claimed as serious, produced work of greater psychological depth and literary innovation than most of what the men were writing in Shinese. The constraint in this case generated the form. The position of observing the world from behind a screen, of understanding social life through its emotional textures rather than its official structures, was precisely the position from which the psychological novel could emerge.
So the invisibility that the social structure imposed became a particular kind of vision.
Yes, and Murasaki used that vision to write about the experience of being observed, desired, and constrained in a world of great beauty that was also a world of very little freedom for the women within it. Her own diary, which survives alongside the novel, shows a woman of considerable critical intelligence and sharp social observation, who was capable of both admiring and gently mocking the culture she served. She describes her fellow ladies in waiting with a precision that is sometimes warm, sometimes cool. She describes her own experience of court life as a combination of interest and alienation. She was present and also a part, engaged and also observing.
So the diary reveals the author rather than the text, and what it reveals is a sensibility that is already analytical.
Yes, and it is that analytical sensibility applied to human emotion and behavior over 1,000 pages of sustained narrative that makes the tale of Genji what it is. Today, as the question of what counts as world literature continues to be debated across universities, publishers, and cultural institutions, Genji occupies a particular position. It is simultaneously a monument, a corrective, and a provocation. A monument because of the depth and scope of the achievement. A corrective because its existence requires any serious account of literary history to reconsider its assumptions about where the novel began and who invented it. A provocation because it raises the question of how many other founding texts remain unread in traditions that Western literary culture has not yet fully incorporated.
So Murasaki asks us not only to read her, but to ask what else we have been missing.
Yes, a woman writing from behind a screen, about the inner lives of people no official history thought worth recording, produced a work that the world is still learning how to read.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the world, the work, and the enduring significance of Murasaki Shikibu.
She wrote about the feeling of things passing away. The feeling has not passed.
This conversation stayed with you. You are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.